Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of Worldview, where we look back through history at some of the strangest things we can find. Now, I know there are a lot of history buffs out there that tend to like the stranger side of history, and they tend to like the stories that half the time don't really make sense as to how they happened. And that's one of the stories we're going to be talking about today. See, I recently decided I was going to go back to school, and I had to take psychology. And one of the things that I had to research was a man named Phineas Gage. Now, Phineas Gage was a railroad worker back in 1848, and he had one of the worst accidents that I myself have ever heard of, and surprisingly, he lived to tell the tale. Today, we'll be talking about how it affected him throughout the remainder of his life, as well as, what happened, what caused the accident, and, like I said, how it affected him and the people around him. So, as I said, Phineas Gage was a railroad worker, and his job was to remove large stones and debris from where the railroad track was going to be going. He was a young man, somewhere around maybe 23, but he was one of the most experienced in his trade. His main tools were his tamping iron, black gunpowder, and he'd run a fuse. A lot of people will get it confused, say he was using dynamite. He wasn't actually using dynamite. What he would do is his tamping iron was sharp at one end, but the other end had something he could dig with. So using his tamping iron, he would dig a hole underneath the rock that he needed to remove. He would fill it with gunpowder, and his assistant would cover the hole and run the fuse. And from a distance, they'd light it, and they would remove the rock. Well, after his assistant would fill the hole, he'd use his tamping iron to tamp the ground and make sure that it was tightly packed so he would have a more controlled explosion. He did this for several years. He didn't have any problems. But one day in 1848, his assistant didn't fill the hole back in. He was sitting on top of the rock, just waiting, and it's unknown whether somebody called his name or what exactly happened. But I know he got distracted, ended up dropping his tamping iron in the hole that was already filled with the black powder, and his iron struck something and caused a spark, which in turn caused a explosion. Now, with the size of the hole, it pretty much turned that hole into a gun barrel, and his tamping iron was the bullet. And it shot that tamping iron straight up and through his head. It entered through his right cheekbone, just under it, and it exited through the top of the left side of his head, going straight through his frontal lobe of his brain. All of his workers rushed over, expecting to find him dead, but to everybody's surprise, he actually sat up. He was asking about what happened with the explosion. He wanted to make sure everyone was okay. And as far as anyone could tell, he had no pain. He wasn't hurting. He just wanted to make sure everyone else was okay, because that's the kind of person he was. He was caring, mild-mannered. He just wanted he wanted his workers to be okay. And because of the fact that he didn't think much of himself there, he just wanted everybody else, it took his workers a good bit of convincing to get him to go to the doctor. The doctor wasn't nearby. He was over in another town and was actually out of the office at the time. And they ended up getting him there. And the doctor's name was Dr. John Harlow. And he had to get word of what happened to Phineas. And when he did, he came immediately back to town. And when he got back, he was stunned to find Phineas just sitting outside on the porch with a big group of people just gathered around. He was telling anybody that would listen about what had happened to him. He had blood running down his head, and Dr. Harlow really didn't have words to describe what he could see happening. Dr. Harlow took him inside, went through a full examination on him. And what he came to the conclusion was that there was no way this man should have been alive. And you see, when there's damage to the brain like that, it causes swelling, and it causes pressure to build up inside the head. But Phineas had what's known as an open fracture, meaning that the pressure wasn't actually building up because it had means to escape, and that's what was keeping him alive. But back in the 1800s, there was all kind of other problems that could come up. The risk of infection was really high, and there really wasn't any way to combat it. See, bacteria wouldn't be discovered to cause infection until roughly 12 years later in 1860. But Phineas seemed to be in pretty decent health, was in good spirits. But they still decided to put him on bed rest, wanted to make sure he had a good full recovery. But Phineas, he liked to work, and so him being put on bed rest didn't sit well with him, and he got agitated with it. The longer he was on bed rest, the more he wanted to get back out there and start doing stuff. Like, he wanted to get back to work. And as time went on, Dr. Harlow could find that he had many psychological changes. Like I said, before the accident, he was mild-mannered. He didn't really cause much trouble. But according to Dr. Harlow's notes, after the accident, it was just like he turned into a different person completely. He was quick to agitation, and according to Dr. Harlow, he indulged in acts most profane. But Phineas did make a full recovery, despite the medical knowledge of the time. See, at one point, he did get worse. And back then, the way that they thought to combat this was a balancing of the humors, which means to balance the yellow and black bile in the body. And when they do this, it causes vomiting, dehydration, and it usually ends pretty bad for the people going through this treatment. But Phineas was a strong, determined young man, and he wanted to survive it. And after his recovery, he was actually asked by scientists at Harvard University to come up there and be studied, because they wanted to know how someone could survive such a traumatic event to the brain. At the time, there were two states of thoughts on how the brain worked. One side said that the whole brain worked as a whole to accomplish tasks. One part could not work without the other. But the other side of that state said that individual parts of the brain controlled certain actions, controlled certain parts of who a person was and what they did. Both sides today are known to be partially correct, partially incorrect, because the whole brain does indeed work as a whole, and it is needed to perform daily functions and everything that needs to be done. But there are parts of the brain that are more important to survival. In Phineas's case, it went through the frontal lobe, which is not pertinent to your survival. But they did find that when that changes his personality, that's how they found out that the frontal lobe of the brain controls your personality. And this is true. But that's not all it's responsible for, but that's for a different discussion. Eventually, Phineas did get tired of being studied, so he ended up leaving to go travel around from city to city until eventually he ended up in the employment of one Phineas T. Barnum. And he worked at Barnum's American Museum in New York. And he was advertised as the only man with a hole in his head. He ended up working for Barnum for, I believe it was around a year, or roughly thereabout, before he ended up moving on out to New Hampshire, where he drove a stagecoach for the remainder of his working life. About 11 years after the accident. Notice this is 11 years with a part of his brain missing. He went home to visit his mother, who had moved in with his sister out in California. And it was at this point that his health took a noticeable decline. And his mother noticed, and he said that it was just from the trip and that it would pass. But soon he started having seizures, and they just kept getting worse and worse. And about a half a year later, he finally ended up passing away due to one of the seizures that he had. Now, this man lived for 11 and a half years after having one of the worst brain injuries I've ever heard of. Now, yes, I know that there are people that have had like half of their brain taken out. That's one thing. That is a surgical procedure due to having swelling on the brain or massive trauma, and it was a way to save them. But this wasn't a surgical procedure. This is just an accident that happened to this man. Like I said, this story has always fascinated me, and it makes you realize just how tough the human body can be. Now, I know other people have talked about Phineas in the past, but I do hope that I was able to give you some new information. We would love to hear from you, so feel free to send in a request for some of your favorite strange historical stories, and we'll do our best to get an episode out to you. This has been Worldview. Join us next time for some more strange stories from history. Thank you.